When the last ice age loosened its grip, the sea did not rise like a single wave. It rose slowly, quietly, generation after generation, covering river mouths, hunting grounds, burial places, and perhaps the oldest coastal settlements humans ever built. The cold fact is this: much of the evidence may now lie where archaeologists can barely reach it. If human history began beside water, how much of our beginning is missing beneath the sea? Before the Ice Age ended, could an entire coastline civilization have vanished beneath the sea? Before the last Ice Age ended, the world that humans knew did not have the coastlines we draw on maps today. The edges of the continents were farther out, the shallow seas around many lands were open ground, and places now covered by water were once plains, river valleys, marshes, forests, and beaches where people could have walked without seeing anything impossible or strange. To understand the thought behind a vanished coastline civilization, we have to begin with this quiet difference. The ocean was not where it is now. During the coldest phases of the Ice Age, enormous amounts of water were locked inside ice sheets, not only in mountain glaciers, but in vast frozen masses spread across northern lands, and when water becomes ice on that scale, the sea must fall. This did not create a fantasy world, but it did expose large coastal shelves that are now hidden beneath shallow water. For early Homo sapiens, whose deep origins were shaped in African landscapes of rivers, lakes, shorelines, and changing climates, the edge between land and water was never just a line. It was a place where fresh water could meet salt water, where birds gathered, where fish, shellfish, plants, and animals could be found in different seasons, and where movement along the coast could be easier than movement across mountains or deserts. If we place ourselves carefully in that older geography, without inventing cities or claiming more than the evidence allows, we can see why the lost coastlines matter. A person standing on a late Ice Age shore might not have known they were standing on land that would one day become seabed. They would have known the wind, the smell of wet ground, the pull of tides, the paths of animals, the places where stone could be found, and the safe routes back to camp. Their world was ordinary to them, but to us it is difficult to study because the map has changed. This is the first problem. Human history is often reconstructed from the places that remain dry. Caves, highlands, river terraces, and inland shelters can preserve traces for a very long time. But low coastal zones, which may have been attractive and useful to people, were often the first places to be drowned as the climate warmed. When we speak about a possible vanished coastline civilization, the careful word is possible, because archaeology must follow evidence. Yet the possibility itself is reasonable enough to examine. It does not require a lost empire beneath the waves. It only requires that human groups lived, learned, gathered food, made tools, raised children, remembered paths, and built small but meaningful worlds on lands that later disappeared beneath rising seas. The end of the Ice Age was not a single moment. It was a long transition in temperature, ice, water, vegetation, and animal life. Across many generations, shorelines moved, sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly in local events, and each change could alter where people found food or where they returned in a season of need. The beginning of humanity's story was never separate from landscape. Our species did not develop as a mind floating above the earth, but as bodies needing water, calories, shelter, memory, and shared routes through real terrain. So if some of the easiest terrain for survival was later submerged, then our record of the human beginning may be uneven from the start. The modern coastline may feel permanent because we are born into it, name it, build near it, and draw it as if it were a fixed border. Yet in deep time it is more like a moving sentence, rewritten by ice and sea. Before the Ice Age ended, some of the lands most useful to people may have lain between the dry world we study and the underwater world we rarely reach, and that missing margin is where the question begins. A coastline was not only a border between land and water, it could be a living zone where many kinds of resources met in one narrow band, and for human beings, that meeting mattered deeply. People did not need comfort in the modern sense, but they did need calories, drinkable water, materials for tools, places to rest, and routes that could be remembered. A coast could offer several of these at once. Rivers carried fresh water toward the sea. Wetlands held birds, fish, reeds, and small animals. Tide pools exposed shellfish and other foods that did not run away. Beaches could collect driftwood, stone, bone, and plant material. None of this means life was easy. Cold, storms, injury, hunger, and danger remained part of human existence. But compared with crossing a dry interior or a high mountain region, a productive shoreline could give small groups a wider set of choices. This is why the idea of lost coastal worlds must begin with ordinary survival, not with imagined monuments. The first human communities were made of bodies, families, memory, and repeated movement. They returned to places because those places answered basic needs. In the deep background of Homo sapiens, beginning in Africa and spreading outward through changing environments, water was one of the strongest guides. A river valley, a lake edge, or a shoreline did not only provide something to drink, it organized the landscape. It told people where animals might come, where plants might grow, where mud might hold tracks, and where travel might be possible without losing direction. Along a coast, the horizon itself could become a guide. One side was water, one side was land, and between them lay a path that could be followed for days or seasons. Such a path would not need roads, maps, or written language. It would be held in memory, in habit, in knowledge passed through repeated journeys. A child growing up near an ice age shore might learn where the tide exposed food, where the wind became dangerous, where fresh water could still be found, and where the ground stayed firm after rain. These are not grand signs of civilization, but they are the small foundations of settled human knowledge. If many such places are now underwater, much of that knowledge has left only faint traces. Archaeology on land often finds stone tools because stone endures, but coastal life may also have depended on things that vanish quickly: wood, fibre, skin, baskets, nets, light shelters, and paths worn into soft ground. The more useful a coastal place was, the more likely it may have been low, wet, and close to the future sea. That creates a difficult paradox. The places that may have supported people well are also the places least likely to remain visible to us. A cave high above the water may preserve a fire pit for thousands of years, while a camp near an old estuary may be buried, scattered, or drowned. For early humans, this would not have looked like a fragile archive. It would have looked like home, or at least like a reliable stopping place. The body would have known the rhythm before the mind named it. Hunger easing when shellfish were gathered, thirst answered by a stream, cold softened by fuel, fear reduced by familiar ground. Human history began from repeated satisfactions of need. A coastline gathered them together, and that is why it could draw people again and again. Before the Ice Age ended, many coastlines were wider, lower, and richer than the edges we see today. If people lived there for generations, they may have formed patterns of work, movement, care, and memory that were real, even if they were not cities. When the sea later moved across those places, it did not only cover land. It covered evidence for why humans may have chosen those shores. The most unsettling thing about an old coastline is that it can disappear without looking, at first, like a disaster. A family may return one season and find the beach narrower. A stream may taste different because salt has moved farther inland. A familiar crossing may stay wet for longer after the tide. A place where children once gathered shellfish may still be there, but only at certain hours, then only in memory, and then not at all. This kind of loss is quiet enough to be mistaken for ordinary change while it is happening. Yet across generations, ordinary change can redraw a world. Before the Ice Age ended, many low coastal plains were not empty edges of the map. They were usable lands. Some may have held camps, paths, tool-making places, hunting stations, fishing spots, and seasonal gathering grounds. If people lived there for long enough, these landscapes could have carried deep human meaning, not because they contained stone temples or written records, but because they held repeated life. A grandmother might know where fresh water seeped through sand. A skilled maker might know which stones broke cleanly near a river mouth. A group might return after winter because birds nested there, fish moved there, or plants grew there after rain. None of this requires us to imagine a lost empire. It only asks us to remember that the first human worlds were built from practice before monuments. In the long story of Homo sapiens, beginning with bodies shaped by African environments and spreading across many climates, Survival depended on the ability to remember useful places and teach that memory. A coastline could store that memory in the shape of the land itself. The curve of a bay, the line of dunes, the mouth of a river, the reef exposed at low tide, and the hollow behind a ridge could become part of a mental map. But when the sea rises, it does not only move over soil, it moves over the memory anchors that helped people organize life. A group can move inland, but the new ground will not immediately contain the same routes, foods, shelters, or stories attached to each place. This is where the vanished coastline becomes more than a geological detail. It becomes a missing human setting. Archaeologists can study what remains on dry land, and sometimes they can search underwater, but the low shore is a difficult place for evidence to survive. Waves break things apart. Currents move objects away from where they were used. Sand buries some traces while exposing others. Organic materials decay unless conditions are unusually kind. The result is not silence, but broken speech. A tool here, a bone there, a drowned surface, a dark layer of ancient soil, a pattern that hints at people but does not easily tell the whole story. That is why the word civilization must be handled carefully. If it means cities, writing, governments, or large monuments, we should not place those things beneath the Ice Age sea without proof. But if we use the word more gently to mean a developed human way of living along a coastline, with shared skills, seasonal knowledge, food traditions, tool habits, and memory between generations, then the idea becomes less sensational and more thoughtful. The danger is not that we know too little. The danger is that our modern map may teach us to look in the wrong place. We see coastlines as borders, while older humans may have known them as corridors, larders, shelters, and teaching grounds. When the sea crossed those grounds, it may have removed evidence for how people adapted before farming, before cities, and before recorded history. What vanished may not have been a kingdom. It may have been a chain of human shore worlds, each small enough to leave little behind, yet together large enough to change what we think the human beginning looked like. Long before coastlines became fixed lines on modern maps, human movement was often shaped by water. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, and shorelines offered more than a place to drink. They gave direction, food, materials, and memory. A river could lead people through a dry landscape. A lake could gather animals, birds, plants, and fish in one place. A coast could stretch like a natural path, with land on one side and sea on the other. For early Homo sapiens, whose beginnings were tied to African environments where survival depended on reading water, plants, animal movement, and seasonal change, this mattered at the level of the body. A person could survive only by finding enough water and food again and again. A group could endure only if it remembered where those needs had been met before. This is why the first long movements of humans should not be imagined as straight lines across empty land. They were more likely a slow search through living corridors, where each river bend, lake edge, or coastal shelf gave another reason to stay for a while, move a little farther, or return when the season changed. Along water, the world could be read with more confidence. Tracks might gather in mud, birds might signal wetlands, fish runs might follow rhythms that people learned by watching. Shellfish could be found in places where tides exposed them. Stones carried by rivers could be shaped into tools. Reeds, wood, bone, and plant fibers could be used for shelter, carrying, tying, or daily work, even if many of those materials rarely survive for archaeologists to find. None of this should be turned into a simple claim that humans always preferred coasts, or that every shoreline held large communities. Landscapes varied, climates shifted, and some coasts were harsh, cold, stormy, or poor in food. But where water, shelter, and resources came together, people had reasons to pause. A pause repeated across generations can become a route. A route repeated across generations can become knowledge. Knowledge repeated long enough can become a human world, even without walls, writing, or cities. This is important for the question of vanished coastlines, because many of the most useful routes may have lain on ground that is no longer dry. When Ice Age seas were lower, rivers often ran across exposed plains before reaching distant shores. Their mouths, deltas, and wetlands would not have been where they are today. A modern beach may be only the last visible edge of a much older system that once extended far outward. If people followed rivers downstream, they may have reached coastlines now beneath the sea. If they moved along shorelines, they may have walked across landforms now hidden under shallow water. If they returned to rich estuaries, some of those estuaries may have vanished as the ocean advanced. The beginning of humanity's wider story was never only about bold migration. It was also about staying alive from day to day, carrying children, avoiding hunger, finding drinkable water, and remembering safe ground. Water routes helped organize that difficulty. They reduced the unknown without removing danger. They gave the eye a line to follow and the mind a pattern to store. In that sense, rivers and coasts were not just scenery around human history. They may have been some of the first teachers of movement, memory, and belonging. And if many of those teachers now lie underwater, then a quiet part of the human journey may be missing from the land-based record. A human body does not meet a landscape as an idea. It meets it through thirst, hunger, cold, fatigue, pain, and the need to keep moving without spending more energy than it can replace. This simple fact makes ancient shorelines important. A coast was not valuable only because it was beautiful or open. It was valuable because it could answer several bodily needs in a small area. Fresh water might arrive through streams or seep through sand near a river mouth. Food might come from fish, shellfish, birds, eggs, plants, small animals, or larger animals drawn toward water. Fuel might gather as driftwood or grow near wetlands. Soft ground could hold tracks. Reeds and plant fibers could be twisted, carried, tied, or woven, even if those objects later disappeared from the archaeological record. For early Homo sapiens, whose origins lay in environments where survival depended on reading change carefully, such places could reduce risk. They did not remove danger. Storms could kill. Cold could weaken the body. Bad seasons could empty a familiar place. Salt water could make thirst worse if fresh water was not nearby. But a shoreline with varied resources offered something very important: options. In a dry interior, failure in one food source might leave few alternatives. Near a productive water edge, people could shift from one resource to another when seasons changed. They could gather small foods when hunting failed. They could use mudflats, marshes, dunes, and riverbanks in different ways. A body that needs calories every day is drawn not only to abundance, but to reliability. This is why the ancient coast may have held repeated human attention. A place that gave enough food once would be remembered. A place that gave food many times might become part of a seasonal pattern. A place where children could learn safe gathering, where elders could pass on knowledge, and where adults could divide work across the group, could become more than a stopping point. It could become a known world. We should not imagine this too neatly. Prehistoric lives were not simple, and evidence does not allow us to describe every detail. Yet the basic biological needs are clear. Humans are social animals with slow-growing children, long learning periods, and bodies that require cooked or prepared foods when possible. Steady hydration, warmth, and cooperation. These needs make dependable landscapes especially important. Israelis, a coast could help because it placed many useful zones close together. The beach, the tide pool, the river mouth, the marsh, the dune, the woodland behind the shore, and the open plain beyond it could all be reached within a rhythm of daily or seasonal movement. In the deep beginning of human history, before farming and before towns, such a landscape could support knowledge that was practical, quiet, and precise. People might know when certain shellfish were safer to collect, where animals crossed wet ground, which stones could hold an edge, which plants grew after rain, and where fresh water remained after dry weeks. These forms of knowledge are not always visible as large ruins. They live first in behavior, memory, and teaching. That is what makes sea level rise so significant. When the ocean moved inland after the coldest ice age conditions began to fade, it did not only cover land. It could cover a whole arrangement of bodily survival: the freshwater place, the food place, the shelter place, the stone place, the safe crossing, the remembered path. A group could move, but the new landscape would demand new learning. The body would still need the same things, but the old answers would be gone or changed. If many human communities once depended on low coastal zones now beneath the sea, then the missing evidence is not only about where people lived. It is about how the human body learned to belong to a changing earth. A coast can guide movement without becoming a road. It does not need stones laid in a line, signs, fences, or names. It guides because it gives the human eye a steady edge to follow. On one side there is land, with plants, animals, shelter, and changing ground. On the other side there is water, with tides, fish, birds, shells, and a horizon that keeps direction from dissolving into confusion. For people moving through an Ice Age world, this kind of edge could matter. The first humans did not spread across the earth as if they were following a plan drawn from above. They moved by living, stopping, returning, learning, and sometimes leaving when a place could no longer answer their needs. A shoreline could support that slow rhythm because it joined movement with survival. A group could walk along it and still find food. They could pause near a river mouth, a sheltered bay, a wetland, or a place where stone and wood were available. They could move again when seasons changed, when animals shifted, when storms damaged a camp, or when another stretch of coast became more useful. In the long beginning of Homo sapiens, shaped by African landscapes and then by many different climates beyond Africa, migration was not only a story of distance. It was a story of repeated decisions made by bodies that needed water, children that needed carrying, elders that held memory, and groups that had to balance risk with possibility. A coast could lower some kinds of risk because it offered a continuous line. Even if people did not know what waited far ahead, they could know that the edge itself continued. Rivers would interrupt it, cliffs might block it, deserts, ice, storms, and rough seas could make some places difficult or impossible. Yet where the coast was passable, it could become a chain of familiar scenes. Beach, inlet, marsh, river, dune, woodland, headland, and beach again. This chain did not need to be fast. It may have unfolded over generations, with one group moving only a little farther than its grandparents, and another group returning to older places when conditions allowed. That is why coastal migration can be misunderstood if we imagine it as a single journey. It may have been more like a long conversation between people and landscape. The land offered food here, danger there, shelter in one season, emptiness in another. People answered by remembering, adjusting, teaching, and moving. If a child learned one stretch of coast, then later raised children farther along the same edge, knowledge could slowly extend without anyone thinking of exploration in the modern sense. This matters for the vanished coastline question because the old coastal road, if we may call it that gently, was often located beyond the shore we see now. During lower sea levels, the coast lay farther out. The rivers reached the sea at different places. Islands could have been hills, bays could have been valleys. Shallow sea floors today could once have held walking routes, camps, and repeated stopping places. When the sea rose, it did not merely flood isolated homes. It may have cut through a whole network of movement. Places that once connected people could become water gaps. Old routes could vanish. High ground could turn into islands. River mouths could shift inland. A chain of human memory could be broken into fragments, leaving archaeologists to find only what survived on the dry side. This is not proof of a lost civilization beneath every shelf sea. It is a reason to be cautious about the map. Human history may have moved along edges that no longer exist as land. The beginning of our wider journey may have followed shorelines that are now silent underwater, and if so, the sea has hidden not only places where people stopped, but also the paths by which they learned to keep going. One of the clearest ways to understand a drowned Ice Age landscape is to look toward the southern North Sea, where dry land once connected Britain to continental Europe. Today that space is water, crossed by ships and shaped by tides, but during periods of lower sea level it included plains, river valleys, wetlands, lakes, marshes, and higher ground. Archaeologists and geologists often call this lost region Doggerland. It was not a mythic continent, and it should not be described as a proven civilization beneath the waves. Its importance is quieter and more useful than that. It shows that a place now absent from the map could once have been a real human landscape. People and animals could move through it, rivers could gather life across it, forests, grasslands, and wetlands could shift across it as climate changed. For human groups living near the end of the Ice Age, such a region may have offered the same things that made many old coastlines valuable: water, animals, fish, birds, plants, stone, wood, and routes between places. In the long story that began with Homo sapiens learning to survive through changing African environments, this kind of mixed landscape would have been meaningful because it gave the body choices. It was neither only sea nor only inland plain. It was a broad meeting zone, and meeting zones often hold life. Doggerland also teaches something more uncomfortable. A landscape can be important and still leave very little on the surface for later people to see. When sea level rose after the coldest Ice Age conditions, the North Sea slowly covered large areas of low ground. The change was not identical everywhere, and it did not happen like a single, simple flood. Some areas may have become marshier, some may have turned into islands, some may have been cut by new channels, and some may have remained usable for a time before disappearing. Later, major events such as submarine landslides and waves may have affected parts of the region, but the broader transformation was tied to warming climate, melting ice, and rising seas over many generations. For people living through it, the world may have seemed to shrink in steps. A hunting route could become harder to cross. A camp could become too wet. Freshwater and saltwater could meet in new places. A place remembered by older people might become unreachable for younger people. Doggerland helps us think about vanished coasts because it turns an abstract idea into a real geographic lesson. The seafloor is not always ancient ocean. Sometimes it is buried land. Sometimes it holds old river channels, peat, animal bones, stone tools, or environmental traces that show what the place was before water covered it. Each discovery is fragmentary, but the fragments matter. They remind us that human history preserved on dry land may be only the surviving edge of a wider world. If people used Doggerland, and evidence suggests humans were present in the broad region during prehistoric times, then some of their ordinary life may now be difficult to recover. Not lost because it never existed, but hidden because the ground itself changed category, from land to sea. This is the lesson we need before asking about a vanished coastline civilization. The strongest evidence may not look like a city. It may look like a drowned valley, a tool lifted from a trawler net, a piece of ancient peat, or an animal bone from a place where humans could also have passed. Doggerland does not prove that an entire complex society disappeared beneath the sea before the Ice Age ended. It does prove something humbler. Large, humanly usable landscapes can vanish from view, and once that is understood, the modern coastline becomes less like a boundary of history and more like the last exposed page of a much larger, damaged book. Doggerland is only one example of a wider pattern. Around the world, the end of the Ice Age changed the shape of coastlines because many continental shelves had once been dry or partly dry land. Two of the most important regions for thinking about this are often called Sunda and Sahul. Sunda refers to the exposed lands that once connected much of mainland Southeast Asia with places that are now islands, including parts of what are today Indonesia, Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. Sahul refers to the ancient landmass that joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania when sea levels were lower. These names do not describe imaginary worlds. They describe real geographic arrangements created by lower seas. When water was locked in ice, shallow seas became plains, valleys, wetlands, and coastlines farther out than the modern shore. For early human groups, these regions mattered because they stood near some of the great pathways of movement and settlement in our species' wider story. Homo sapiens, beginning from African origins and gradually spreading into many environments, did not enter a fixed Earth. People entered a planet whose edges kept changing. In Southeast Asia and near Australia, lower sea levels meant that distances between lands were different. River systems reached farther, and large areas now underwater could have offered food, shelter, and travel routes. This does not mean all of Sunda or Sahul was easy to cross or evenly populated. Tropical forests, open grasslands, mountains, swamps, storms, and changing climates all shaped where people could live, but the exposed shelves would have changed what was possible. A journey that looks like island hopping on a modern map may have looked different when shorelines extended outward and some seas were narrower. A place that is now a channel of water may once have been a low plain. A bay may once have been a valley. A modern island may once have been part of a larger landscape. This is where the question of vanished coastal life becomes more serious and less sensational. If people live near old rivers, wetlands, and shores in these regions, Many of their traces may now be underwater. We should be careful not to call every drowned plain a civilization. The evidence for early life in these broad regions is uneven, and much remains difficult to reach. Yet the geography itself tells us that modern coastlines are not the whole story. In Sunda, lowered seas would have exposed vast areas between mainland Asia and present-day islands, creating wider routes and habitats than the map shows today. In Sahul, people reached Australia and New Guinea long before the modern shoreline took its present form, which means their early landscapes included coasts, river systems, and plains that no longer appear as land. The beginning of human presence in these regions was tied not only to courage or invention, but to the practical ability to read water, food, season, and distance. A group moving through such a world would not have thought in terms of continents. They would have known usable ground, dangerous water, animal movement, plant growth, stone sources, and the memory of elders. When the seas rose, they altered those known relationships. Lowlands became straits, river mouths shifted, shore camps disappeared. Routes that once connected people may have broken apart. Some communities may have moved inland. Others may have adapted to new island worlds. Over time, the old geography became invisible to anyone who only looked at the surface of the sea. Sunda and Sahul remind us that the earth itself has edited the human record. The missing coast is not one place. It is a repeating margin around many continents, where the earliest chapters of human adaptation may have been written on ground that later sank beneath the water. Many ancient coastlines are difficult to imagine because they are not far out in the deep ocean. They are often on continental shelves, the shallow rims around landmasses where the sea today may look ordinary, but where the ground beneath was once dry, wet, forested, grassy, marshy, or crossed by rivers. During colder Ice Age conditions, when so much water was held in ice, these shelves became extensions of the continents. When the climate warmed and ice melted, the water returned to the ocean and the shelves were slowly covered again. This is why so many old shorelines now lie below modern water. They were not swallowed because they were mysterious. They disappeared because they were low. The same quality that made them useful to people also made them vulnerable. Low ground near water can be rich in life. It can hold wetlands, estuaries, river mouths, tidal flats, and gentle routes across open land. But low ground is also the first ground the sea can take back. For early Homo sapiens, whose story began in landscapes where water, season, memory, and movement shaped survival, such places could have carried enormous practical value. They were not empty margins. They may have been the working edges of human life. A group could gather food there, rest there, watch animal movement there, shape tools there, and teach children how to read the world. Yet after sea level rose, the same places became seafloor, and the evidence became harder to find, harder to date, and harder to interpret. This creates a quiet distortion in the record. Inland sites may seem more important simply because they remained visible. A cave survives above the sea. A high terrace stays dry. A desert surface may preserve stone tools for a very long time. But a camp on an old coastal plain might be broken by waves, buried by sand, moved by currents, or sealed beneath layers of marine sediment. Even when something survives, it may no longer sit exactly where people left it. A stone tool could be displaced. A bone could be carried away. A hearth could be erased by erosion. A wooden object could rot long before anyone could find it. The absence of evidence, in such a setting, cannot always be treated as evidence that no one lived there. It may only mean that the archive was placed in the hardest possible location. Around the world, the same pattern repeats. Off many coasts, broad shelves slope gently from the modern land into shallow seas. During lower sea levels, those shelves change the shape of continents. Islands could join larger land masses, straits could narrow, river valleys could continue far beyond the present beach. Coastal plains could stretch where fishing boats now pass. To the people living then, these lands would not have been temporary. They would have been the known earth. No one would have watched the horizon and understood future sea level charts. They would have known where water was drinkable, where storms came from, where animals moved, and where the old people said food could be found. The beginning of human history was made from that scale of knowledge, not from global maps, but from repeated contact between body and place. When the shoreline moved inland, some of that knowledge may have had to move with it, but knowledge tied to a particular bay, stream, reef, or plain cannot be carried unchanged. It loses its anchor. This is why drowned shelves matter so much. They remind us that prehistoric geography was wider than the land we now walk on. They also warn us to be modest. A vanished coastline does not automatically mean a vanished city, and a submerged plain does not prove a lost civilization. But it does mean that some human worlds may be missing from view because the places most likely to preserve their daily meaning are now beneath water. The word civilization is heavy, and it can easily mislead us when we speak about people who lived before farming, before writing, and before the kinds of cities that later appear in the archaeological record. If we place that word too quickly beneath the Ice Age sea, we create a story stronger than the evidence. A vanished coastline civilization, in the careful sense, should not mean a hidden empire, a lost capital, or a planned society with monuments waiting under the waves. It should mean something quieter, but still important, a developed human way of living along ancient shores, shaped by shared knowledge, repeated places, learned skills, and memory carried between generations. This distinction matters because early human complexity did not begin only when people built large stone structures. Long before that, Homo sapiens had already become a species of teaching, cooperation, tool use, fire, language, social memory, and landscape knowledge. These abilities began in the deep human past, rooted in African environments and refined as people entered new regions. A group living along a productive Ice Age coast could have possessed a rich life without leaving behind anything that looks like a city. They might have known the tides, the safest freshwater sources, the seasons of birds and fish, the places where shellfish were easier to gather, the stones that made better cutting edges, and the sheltered ground where people could return after storms. Such knowledge is not simple. It is not primitive in the careless sense of that word. It is precise, practical, and often invisible after the people are gone. A community can be complex because its members divide tasks, care for children, remember routes, make tools for different uses, prepare food, avoid dangers, and pass down what works. None of these things require walls or kings. They require attention, time, and trust. Along a coastline, that attention could become especially detailed because the environment changed daily and seasonally. The tide moved, birds arrived and left, fish followed patterns, storms reshaped the shore, fresh water might shift when sandbars moved or salt pushed inland. To live there well, people had to notice. A careless group could lose food, tools, or safety. A careful group could turn change into knowledge. This is one reason the Lost Coast question is worth asking carefully. The kind of human world that may have vanished would not necessarily look grand to a modern imagination, but it could have been deeply ordered from within. The order might have existed in where people slept, who knew which path, how tools were made, how food was shared, when a group moved, and how children learnt the shore. Archaeology often preserves the durable edges of this life. Stone, bone, shell, charcoal, sometimes ancient soils. But the softer centre can disappear. Voices disappear. Wooden frames disappear. Fibre nets disappear. Baskets disappear. Light shelters disappear. A place of repeated gathering may leave only scattered objects if waves, currents, and sediment disturb it. For this reason, we should not judge an ancient coastal life only by whether it produced monuments. Human history began with adaptation before architecture. It began with bodies learning places and groups turning experience into memory. If low Ice Age coasts supported many such communities, then the sea may have covered not a single lost kingdom, but a wide pattern of human intelligence in daily use. Some groups may have been small, some may have met others along familiar routes, some may have returned only in certain seasons. The careful question is not whether we can prove a forgotten city beneath every drowned shelf. The careful question is how much organized human life could exist without leaving the kinds of remains we are trained to recognize. If a developed coastal life existed before the last Ice Age fully ended, its signs would not necessarily announce themselves as ruins. They might appear as smaller traces, each modest alone, but meaningful when placed together. One sign could be the repeated use of marine food, shells, fish bones, seal bones in colder regions, bird remains, and tools suited for cutting, scraping, or processing food can suggest that people knew how to use the water's edge. Shell middens, where preserved, are especially important because they can show repeated gathering over time. Yet many old coastal middens would now be underwater, eroded, or scattered. Another sign could be stone tools found near ancient shorelines, river mouths, or drowned surfaces. Stone survives when almost everything else fails. A blade, flake, scraper, point, or grinding stone cannot tell a whole life by itself, but it can show human hands at work in a place. If such tools appear with animal remains, charcoal, shells, or old ground surfaces, the picture becomes more careful and more convincing. For Homo sapiens, whose beginnings were shaped by practical adaptation long before written memory, tools were not symbols of progress in a simple upward line. They were answers to immediate needs: cutting skin, opening shells, shaping wood, preparing plants, breaking bone, or making other tools. Along a coast, the same tool might serve several purposes in a day. A group could gather shellfish at low tide, mend a light shelter, butcher a small animal, and prepare fuel before night. Fire is another sign, though it is fragile in wet and moving landscapes. Charcoal, burned stone, heated shell, or darkened ancient soil can show that people cooked, warmed themselves, processed materials, or gathered around a place long enough to leave a heat trace. Fire also reminds us that coastal life was not only about food. It was about warmth, safety, social contact, and the long human habit of making a small circle of light inside a large environment. A seasonal camp might leave only faint marks: a scatter of flakes, a patch of charcoal, broken shells, a few bones, post holes if conditions were kind, or changes in soil that are easy to miss. Light dwellings made of wood, reeds, hide, or plant fibre could vanish almost completely. Nets, baskets, cordage, wooden handles, carrying bags, mats, and simple boats or rafts would often decay unless sealed in rare preserving conditions. This is why a vanished coastline way of life may be hard to recognize. Its strongest technologies may have been made from the weakest materials. The human body did not live by stone alone. It lived by carrying, tying, wrapping, sheltering, cooking, gathering, and sharing. The beginning of our species' story is filled with such perishable intelligence because people had to solve daily problems with what the landscape gave them. Along an ice age shore, a community might return in spring for birds and eggs, in another season for fish, and in another for plants or animals drawn to water. The place could be used again and again without becoming permanently settled in the later farming sense. That repeated return is still important. It means people remembered the shore as part of a wider map of survival. If the sea later covered that map, archaeologists might find only the hardest fragments: shell, stone, bone, charcoal. The rest would be absence. But absence should not be mistaken for emptiness. A coastline life could have been rich in knowledge, yet poor in durable remains, and that is exactly why it can vanish so quietly from history. The question is not whether every shore held the same pattern, or whether all evidence points in one direction. It is whether the missing coast could hide many local experiments in living with water, each small in scale, yet important to the long human beginning. A coastal life can vanish more easily than an inland one, because so much of it is made with materials that do not want to last. Stone endures, but a human world is never made only of stone. It is made of wood, skin, fibre, reed, cord, food waste, footprints, sleeping places, small fires, carried objects, and repeated gestures. Near the sea, many of these traces face water, salt, wind, storms, burrowing animals, shifting sand, and later, the slow pressure of rising sea level. A camp used for many seasons might still leave almost nothing that looks impressive after thousands of years. A shelter frame can rot, a basket can disappear, a net can decay, a wooden handle can separate from a stone tool and leave only the stone behind. A path through dunes can be erased by one storm. A fire can be scattered by waves. A burial place, if one existed near low ground, could be disturbed by erosion before anyone in the distant future had the chance to study it. This is not a weakness of ancient people. It is a weakness of preservation. Homo sapiens began as a species whose intelligence lived first in action, memory, and cooperation, long before it lived in durable buildings. From the early human starting point in changing African landscapes to later movements across shorelines, plains, forests, and islands, people solved problems with whatever the environment offered. The better a material was for daily life, the more likely it was to vanish. Flexible fibre is useful because it bends. Wood is useful because it can be shaped. Hide is useful because it can wrap, cover, and carry. But the same softness that makes these materials useful also makes them poor witnesses after deep time. Coastal places add another difficulty. They are active landscapes. A dry cave can protect an old surface. A high desert can leave stone tools where they fell. A buried inland camp can sometimes remain sealed beneath quiet sediment. But a shore is rarely quiet for long. Tides lift and drop. Waves sort objects by weight. Currents move bones, shells, and stones. Rivers bring floods and mud. Sand can cover evidence, then uncover it, then carry it away. As the Ice Age ended and seas rose, whole old surfaces could be drowned, broken, or sealed beneath marine layers. Some traces may survive beautifully in rare conditions, especially where peat, mud, or low oxygen protects organic matter. But those conditions are not guaranteed, and they are hard to reach when they lie underwater. This means the archaeological record of coastal life is not simply incomplete by accident. It is shaped by the physical character of the coast itself. When we ask whether an entire coastline civilization may have vanished beneath the sea, the most careful answer must notice this fragility. A complex way of living could exist without leaving large monuments. It could depend on seasonal return, food knowledge, tool habits, shared routes, and the teaching of children. If that life was built close to old estuaries, beaches, and wetlands, the sea could remove its setting and damage its remains at the same time. What survives might be only a handful of hard objects and environmental clues, not because the life was empty, but because most of its substance belonged to perishable time. The beginning of human history may therefore be biased toward what hard ground allowed to survive. The coast may have held soft technologies, soft shelters, and soft memories, all powerful in life and faint in death. This is why a vanished shoreline is not only a missing place. It is a missing kind of evidence, one that asks us to be patient before deciding what early humans did not know, did not build, or did not remember. When the last ice age began to loosen, the sea did not rise because the ocean suddenly decided to move. It rose because the Earth's water was changing places. For a long time, enormous quantities of water had been stored as ice across high mountains and northern lands. As climate warmed, some of that frozen water returned to rivers, lakes, and oceans. This process was not smooth everywhere, and it did not happen at one steady speed across the whole planet. Some coasts changed slowly. Some places changed in pulses. Some lowlands became wetter before they became sea. Some valleys turned into estuaries. Some plains became marshes, then tidal flats, then shallow water. To people living near those edges, the change may not have looked like one dramatic event. It may have looked like a world that kept asking them to adjust. A campsite that had once been safe could flood more often. A dry path between two raised areas could become muddy. A river mouth could shift. A freshwater source could become brackish. Animals might move differently as vegetation changed. Fish and birds might appear in new rhythms. The old coastline would not vanish in a single human thought, but across many remembered lives. This matters because Homo sapiens began as a species adapted to changing environments, not to a fixed Earth. From our deeper origins in African landscapes of water, heat, dryness, grassland, woodland, and season, human survival depended on noticing change early enough to respond. The end of the Ice Age tested that ability on a much larger geographic scale. It changed not only temperature, but the shape of the world people could walk across. A shore that once lay far beyond the modern beach could retreat inland generation by generation. To one person, the change might be measured by a familiar fishing place becoming less reliable. To another, born later, the old place might already be a story told by elders. This is how sea level rise can become a human loss without appearing as a single catastrophe. It removes space slowly enough that each generation may accept a new normal, yet strongly enough that, after many generations, the map of life is transformed. The warming climate also changed plants and animals. As ice retreated, some regions opened to new vegetation, while others lost the cold-adapted environments that had supported different animals. People who depended on a mixed coastal landscape had to read all of these changes together. The shoreline was not just a line of water. It was connected to rivers, wetlands, forests, dunes, hunting grounds, gathering places, and paths between groups. When sea level rose, those connections shifted. A marsh might become saltier. A wooded lowland might become flooded. A place where people gathered shellfish might remain useful for a while, then move, then disappear. The beginning of human history is often told through movements across land, but here the land itself was moving in relation to the sea. Not moving like an animal, but changing category. Dry ground becoming wet ground becoming shoreline becoming seabed. This slow transformation may have shaped memory, settlement, and migration before farming spread widely in many regions. It may have pushed groups inland, separated once connected areas, and erased the easiest routes along old coastal shelves. Yet we should remain careful. Rising seas do not prove that a large organized civilization disappeared beneath every coast. They do show that many places where people could have lived, learned, and returned were placed directly in the path of water. The cold fact is simple. When the Ice Age ended, the sea did not only cover empty land, it covered parts of the human stage itself. When the sea rises, it does not change only the place where waves break. It reaches into rivers, soils, plants, animals, and the daily choices of people who depend on them. One of the quietest changes is salt. A river that once tasted fresh near its mouth can become brackish as the ocean pushes inland. A marsh that once held certain plants can shift toward plants that tolerate salt. A pool used for drinking can become less reliable. Fish may move differently. Birds may feed in new places. Shellfish beds can appear, move, or disappear as currents, sediment, and salinity change. To a modern map, this may look like a coastline moving. To a human body, it is more direct. Thirst becomes harder to answer, food becomes less predictable, and old knowledge needs revision. This is why sea level rise after the Ice Age mattered in more than one dimension. It was not simply water covering land, it was the changing of a whole living system around the water's edge. For Homo sapiens, whose deeper beginning was shaped by environments where survival depended on reading water, season, animal movement, and plant change, such shifts would have required constant attention. People could not survive by loving a place in the abstract. They had to know what could be eaten, what could be drunk, where shelter stood, where storms entered, and where children could be kept safe. When salt moved into a low river valley, it could alter all of those answers. A place might still look familiar from a distance, but its usefulness might fade. The same bend of river could hold fewer drinkable pools. The same wetland could offer different plants. The same crossing could become soft, deep, or dangerous. The sea, in this sense, did not only take territory, it changed the rules of living before it fully covered the ground. This slow pressure may be one reason old coastal communities, if they existed in repeated and organized forms, would have moved in stages rather than in one sudden escape. People may have shifted camps slightly higher, followed fresh water upstream, changed gathering places, or returned at different times of year. A shoreline group might not abandon a whole region at once. It might adjust, then adjust again, until the old pattern no longer held together. That pattern could include more than one camp. It could include a freshwater source, a stone source, a shellfish bed, a place for shelter, a route to inland animals, and a meeting place with other people. If salt water altered one piece, the rest might still function. If it altered several pieces across generations, the human map could begin to break apart. This is the kind of loss that leaves little dramatic evidence. There may be no burned city, no battlefield, no single layer of destruction. There may only be a gradual movement away from places that once made sense. In the beginning of our species' wider journey, humans lived by combining memory with flexibility. Too little memory, and every day becomes dangerous. Too little flexibility, and a changing landscape becomes impossible. Rising seas forced both capacities to work together. Old people may have remembered where fresh water had once been closer to the shore. Younger people may have learned a new inland spring, as if it had always been central. Across time, the old coast could pass from working knowledge into story, then from story into silence. We must be careful not to claim what cannot be proved, but it is reasonable to say that when salt entered rivers, when wetlands shifted, and when food grounds changed, the sea was already erasing coastal life before the land finally disappeared beneath it. A coastline can be lost without a single day that everyone remembers as the day it ended. That is one of the hardest ideas to hold, because human imagination often looks for a great flood, a night of panic, or a line where safety suddenly became ruin, but many drowned Ice Age landscapes may have disappeared through something quieter. The sea could arrive as a repeated inconvenience before it became a permanent boundary. A storm might cut farther into a dune. A spring tide might reach a sleeping place that had once stayed dry. A marsh might spread into ground where people walked. A river path might need to be crossed earlier in the day, then only in certain seasons, then not at all. Each change could be small enough to accept. Together, across generations, they could erase the working shape of a world. For Homo sapiens, whose deeper beginnings were shaped by adapting to change rather than controlling it, this kind of slow loss would have met both the strength and the limit of human flexibility. People can move a camp. They can learn a new water source. They can shift gathering places, follow animals inland, and teach children a safer route. But when the ground itself keeps changing, each adjustment may carry a cost. A new place may lack good stone. A better spring may be farther from shellfish beds. Higher ground may be safer from tides but colder, more exposed, or less rich in food. An inland route may separate people from neighbouring groups they once met along the shore. This is why sea level rise was not only a movement of water, it was a reorganization of relationships. The relationship between fresh water and salt water changed. The relationship between camp and food changed. The relationship between memory and place changed. A community might survive, but the older pattern of life could thin out, piece by piece. This is a careful way to think about a vanished coastline civilization. It does not require sudden destruction. It may have been more like the slow unweaving of a net. One strand was a fishing place. Another was a freshwater pool. Another was a path to higher ground. Another was a place where people returned at a certain season. Another was the remembered location of stone, fuel, shelter, or safe crossing. If enough strands broke, the old life could no longer hold its shape. The people might not vanish. They might become inland people, island people, river people, or neighbours of other groups. Their descendants might continue, carrying fragments of old knowledge into new landscapes. What vanished would be the coastal arrangement itself. Archaeology may struggle to see such a process because it leaves no simple ending. There may be no final layer that says a world was lost. There may be only fewer traces, shifted traces, drowned traces, and long gaps where evidence once lay on low ground. The beginning of human history was lived at the scale of families and groups, not at the scale of future maps. A person did not need to understand global warming to feel that a place was becoming harder to use. They only needed to know that the old water tasted wrong, the old path was gone, or the old camp no longer felt safe. Over many lives, this kind of noticing could guide movement without producing a dramatic story. That may be the coldest part of the question. A coastline civilization, in the careful sense of a shared and practiced way of life, could disappear while its people adapted well enough to survive. The sea would not need to erase humanity. It would only need to erase the places that made one human world possible, leaving later history to begin from the higher, drier margins that happen to remain visible to the future eye looking backward through scattered and broken evidence. Migration is often imagined as a dramatic leaving, but for people living beside a slowly changing Ice Age coast, departure may have been much quieter. It may have begun with smaller choices. A camp was moved a little higher. A gathering place was used less often. A freshwater source farther inland became more important. A route once taken without thought was avoided after storms. A family returned later in the season, or stopped returning at all. This kind of movement does not look like flight from a distance. It looks like adaptation, repeated many times, until the center of life has shifted. For Homo sapiens, whose beginnings were shaped by the need to move through changing African landscapes, migration was never only about walking far away. It was also about knowing when to stay, when to wait, and when a familiar place no longer answered the body's needs. A coastline affected by rising seas would have demanded that judgment over and over. People did not need to understand ice sheets or global sea level to respond. They needed only to notice that the tide reached farther, that salt entered a stream, that food was harder to find, or that the old sleeping ground stayed wet too long. These observations could lead to movement without panic. A group might keep one foot in the old coast and one foot in the new inland world for a long time. They might still visit the shore for shellfish, fish, birds, or memory, while placing safer camps beyond the reach of water. They might follow rivers upstream, because rivers connected the drowned edge to higher ground. They might join relatives or neighbouring groups who already knew inland resources better. In this way, a vanished coastline life could dissolve into other ways of living rather than end in a single break. The people could survive while the old pattern disappeared. This distinction matters. When we ask whether an entire coastline civilization may have vanished beneath the sea, the careful question is not whether all its people died. More likely, in many places, people moved, mixed, adapted, and carried pieces of coastal knowledge with them. They may have remembered old fishing grounds that younger people never saw. They may have told children about land beyond the present shore. They may have kept tool habits, food preferences, seasonal movements, or stories tied to water long after the original places were gone. Archaeology can find bones, stone, shell, and charcoal, but it cannot easily find the feeling of becoming a different kind of people because the land under memory has changed. The beginning of human history was not written in documents. It was held in bodies, in repeated paths, in shared names for places, and in lessons spoken from older people to younger ones. If a coastline was lost slowly, then migration itself could become a bridge between a vanished shore and a surviving inland record. Yet that bridge is hard to see. A tool found inland may not tell us that its maker's parents once lived closer to the sea. A campsite on higher ground may look like a beginning when it might actually be an arrival after loss. A new route may hide an older route underwater. This is how the archaeological record can make movement seem simpler than it was. The sea takes the low ground, and the remaining evidence begins higher up, as if history started there. But human lives do not begin where evidence survives. They begin where people learn to live. A slow retreat from the coast could have preserved people while erasing the setting that had shaped them, leaving the future to wonder whether disappearance meant death, or only a quieter transformation. A shoreline does not have to vanish all at once for people to begin moving away from it. In many places, the first movement may have been only a small correction. A shelter was placed beyond the reach of a high tide. A cooking place was made farther from the wet ground. A path to fresh water was changed because the old one crossed mud too often. A family group spent fewer nights near the shore and more nights along a river valley. To one generation, these changes might have seemed practical and ordinary. To the next, they might have become the new pattern. After many such adjustments, the old coastal life could stand behind them like a fading map. This kind of retreat is important because it matches the scale at which human beings often adapt. Homo sapiens did not begin as a species that changed the whole earth at once. Our deeper beginning was shaped by careful attention to local signs, where water gathered, where animals moved, where plants ripened, where firewood could be found, and where danger was likely. Along a rising sea, those signs would not simply disappear. They would move. People might follow them inland, step by step. A freshwater spring farther from the beach could become central. A ridge once used only during storms could become a regular camp. A riverbank that had been a path to the sea could become the main place of life. Children born into the new arrangement might hear of the lower shore as something older people remembered, not as the world they personally knew. That is how a coastline can be lost through generations. The people remain, but the centre of their knowledge shifts. A grandfather may remember walking across ground now covered at high tide. A parent may remember using it only in dry seasons. A child may know it only as dangerous water. None of them needs to be wrong. Each carries a different layer of the same changing place. This makes the vanished coastline question more human and more difficult. Archaeology may look for a clear break, but family memory may have moved in gradients. A group could still gather shellfish while hunting more often inland. It could still use coastal stone while sleeping on higher ground. It could still tell stories of a bay while no longer living beside it. The old life would not end on a single day. It would become mixed with the new life until its original shape was hard to separate. If several neighbouring groups went through similar changes, a whole coastal network could thin out. Meeting places might move upstream. Marriage ties or exchange routes might follow safer ground. Seasonal gatherings could happen farther inland. Old paths along the shore might be replaced by paths around marshes, cliffs, or new inlets. In the beginning of human history, social survival depended not only on food, but on other people, who knew a place, who could share tools, who carried memory, who could help in a bad season. When the sea divided or narrowed the old routes, those human relationships also had to adjust. Some may have strengthened in new places, others may have faded when distance and water made return harder. This is one reason the phrase "vanished beneath the sea" can be misleading if we hear it too simply. The land may have vanished beneath the sea, but the people may have carried themselves elsewhere. What disappeared was the old fit between bodies, memory, food, water, roots, and familiar ground. A coastline civilization, understood carefully as a practiced way of living, could retreat inland without leaving a dramatic ruin. It could leave descendants, changed habits, scattered tools, and stories whose oldest landmarks were already underwater. A place can disappear from the ground and still remain for a while inside human memory. This is one reason a drowned coastline may leave traces that are not only material, but also difficult, indirect, and easily misunderstood. People who moved away from a changing shore may have carried more than tools. They may have carried roots, warnings, names, food habits, stories of old places and ways of reading water. A child might learn that beyond the present beach there had once been dry ground. A younger hunter might hear that an elder once crossed a valley where there is now a bay. A group might remember that certain storms came from the same direction that had taken an old camp. These memories would not be maps in the modern sense. They would be living knowledge, shaped by use, retelling, forgetting, and change. For Homo sapiens, whose beginnings were rooted in social learning as much as in physical adaptation, memory was never a decoration added to survival. It was part of survival itself. People endured because they could carry lessons beyond one lifetime. They knew what plants to avoid, where animals moved, when water failed, how tools were made, and which places could be trusted. When sea level rose and old coastlines changed, memory may have become the bridge between the lost shore and the new ground. Yet memory changes as it travels. A practical warning can become a story can lose its exact place. A remembered flood can merge with another flood. A real retreat from the sea can become, after a long time, a tale of land swallowed, ancestors displaced, or water crossing a boundary it should not cross. We should be careful here. It would be wrong to claim that every flood story preserves an Ice Age event, or that oral traditions can always be tied directly to one drowned landscape. Human memory is powerful, but it is not a perfect recording device. Still, it is reasonable to think that major environmental losses could remain meaningful long after physical traces became hard to find. A coastline that fed people for generations would not vanish from thought as soon as people moved inland. It could remain in gestures, taboos, seasonal habits, place names, or stories whose original geography slowly blurred. Archaeology may not easily detect this. A stone tool can be measured. A shell layer can be dated if preserved. Ancient soil can be sampled. But a memory that has passed through many voices leaves no simple object. It may survive only as a pattern in how people talk about water, danger, origin, or loss. The beginning of human history was carried in such fragile forms before it was ever carved, written, or built in stone. This makes the vanished coastline question more delicate. If a coastal way of life disappeared beneath the sea, its material remains may be underwater, damaged, or gone, while its memory may have moved inland with the people who survived. Later generations might no longer know the exact shape of the old land, but they could inherit the emotional outline. There was once more ground, the water came farther, people moved, and the world was not always as it is now. That kind of memory cannot prove a civilization. It cannot replace excavation, dating, or physical evidence, but it can remind us that human loss is not measured only by ruins. Sometimes the longest survival of a vanished place is not a wall or a tool, but a story that keeps pointing toward water, even after the shore that created it has gone silent beneath the sea. Searching for human traces beneath the sea is not like searching on dry land with water added on top. It is a different kind of work, shaped by darkness, pressure, movement, cost, and uncertainty. On land, an archaeologist can walk a surface, notice stone tools, study a cave floor, follow layers in a trench, and return again and again to the same place with relative ease. Underwater, even finding the old land surface can be difficult. The seabed may be covered by sand, mud, shells, modern debris, or thick marine sediment. Currents may reduce visibility. Storms can reshape the bottom. A place that looks flat and empty may hide an ancient river valley beneath layers that are hard to reach. A place with scattered objects may not preserve where those objects were originally used. This is why underwater archaeology often begins before anyone sees an artifact. It begins with maps of the seabed, sonar, sediment cores, old river channels, drowned forests, peat layers, and careful guesses about where people might have lived when the land was dry. For Homo sapiens, whose deep beginning was tied to practical landscapes of water, food, shelter, and movement, the most important places were not always the places easiest for us to find later. A low estuary, a wetland, a beach camp, or a sheltered bay could have been useful for generations, yet today it may lie beneath shifting sand or disturbed seabed. The difficulty is not only technical, it is interpretive. If a stone tool is found on the seafloor, the first question is whether it rests near where a person left it, or whether waves, rivers, ice, fishing nets, or currents moved it. If a bone appears, it must be understood as part of an old environment, not immediately as proof of a human camp. If charcoal is found, researchers must ask whether it came from human fire, natural burning, or later movement through sediment. Underwater evidence often needs several lines of support before it can speak clearly. The sea also makes excavation slower. Divers have limited time. Equipment is expensive. Remote vehicles can help, but they do not replace careful interpretation. Every sample has to be located in 3 dimensions, protected from contamination, lifted safely, and studied against a changing geological background. On land, a site may be exposed over a wide area. Underwater, the old surface may appear only through narrow windows. This can make a human landscape feel like a set of fragments, even if it was once continuous. The beginning of human history did not happen in fragments, but the evidence reaches us that way. A group may have used a shore for years, returned season after season, taught children there, repaired tools there, cooked there, and moved along familiar paths. After the sea came in, that same place might be broken into hints. A submerged soil, a scatter of stone, a preserved tree stump, a shell deposit, a channel filled with sediment. The story is not gone, but it is no longer easy to read. This is why the missing coastline cannot be judged by the same standards as a dry cave or a stone monument. The sea hides evidence unevenly. Sometimes it destroys, sometimes it preserves. Sometimes it buries so well that the past waits beyond our reach. A vanished coastline way of life may therefore remain scientifically possible, while still being difficult to prove in detail. The honest position is neither to dismiss it too quickly, nor to fill the silence with fantasy. It is to understand that the sea is both a destroyer and an archive, and that reading its archive requires patience. Some things can survive beneath the sea because they were already durable before the water arrived. Stone is the clearest example. A stone tool may lose its handle, its place, and its human context, but the worked edge can remain. A flake struck from a core, a scraper used on hide or wood, a point shaped for cutting, or a heavy stone used for grinding can hold the mark of human intention long after softer materials are gone. Bone can also survive, especially when it is buried quickly or protected from strong movement. Shell can survive in large quantities, and shell is valuable because it can point toward gathering, eating, tool use, or the repeated presence of people near the water's edge. Charcoal may survive as a dark trace of fire. Ancient peat, buried soils, pollen, seeds, and wood can sometimes remain sealed in wet, low-oxygen places, allowing researchers to reconstruct the lost environment. These surviving materials do not speak in a loud voice, but they can form a careful pattern. For Homo sapiens, whose beginning was shaped by practical knowledge of water, food, fire, tools, and movement, even a small set of durable traces can matter. A stone tool beside an old land surface means more than an isolated object. A tool near animal remains, burned material, shells, or a drowned river channel can begin to show how people used a place. It still does not prove a city. It does not prove a large, organized society. But it can prove presence, activity, and sometimes repeated use. That is already important when the land itself has become seabed. Underwater archaeology often looks for these hard survivors because they are the most likely to remain when waves, salt, and time have removed almost everything else. A submerged forest can show that a place was once dry or wetland. A layer of peat can show that plants grew there before the sea covered it. Pollen inside sediment can suggest what kind of vegetation surrounded old human roots. Animal bones can show what species lived nearby. Cut marks on bone, if clearly identified, may suggest human processing. Burned stones or charcoal may suggest fire, if the surrounding evidence supports it. A drowned channel can show where fresh water once flowed. Each clue is limited, but together they help rebuild a landscape that no longer appears on the surface of the earth. This is where the question of a vanished coastline way of life becomes more grounded. We do not need to imagine golden buildings under the sea. We need to ask whether old coastal plains contain the ordinary materials of human survival, and whether enough of them survived to show how people lived there. The beginning of our human story was built from ordinary materials used with extraordinary patience. Stone shaped by hand, fire held through night, shell opened for food, bone broken for marrow, wood carried, plants gathered, children taught where to step. Of these, only some can endure. The sea selects harshly. It may leave stone while taking the basket that carried it. It may preserve a shell heap while removing the shelter beside it. It may seal a tree stump and erase the footprints around it. Because of this, the surviving record is always thinner than the life that produced it. Still, the things that remain can keep the question open in an honest way. A drowned coast may not reveal a complete human world, but if it preserves stone, bone, shell, charcoal, buried soil, and old freshwater channels, it can show that the world was once there, and that people may have known it well before the sea covered it. What usually disappears from an ancient coast is often what would have made that life feel most human. Stone may remain, shell may remain, and bone may sometimes remain, but the softer materials of daily survival often vanish first. A wooden post that helped hold a shelter can decay. A woven mat can dissolve into the soil. A cord made from plant fiber can disappear without leaving its shape. A net used for fish can vanish, even if fishing was central to life. A basket used to carry shells, roots, tools, or sleeping material may leave no trace at all. A skin covering, a wooden handle, a reed screen, a small child's carrying sling, a paddle, a light frame for shade, or a simple trap placed near water can all disappear while the stone flakes nearby survive. This creates a deep imbalance in the archaeological record. The materials most useful for daily living are often the least likely to reach us. For Homo sapiens, whose beginnings were shaped by flexible hands, social learning, and the need to solve problems in changing environments, this matters greatly. Human intelligence did not exist only in sharpened stone. It also existed in tying, folding, weaving, carrying, drying, storing, repairing, and placing things where they were needed. Along a coast, those skills may have been especially important. People might have used fiber to hold food, wood to reach water, reeds to make shelter, hide to carry infants, branches to steady a camp, and plant materials to help process fish or shellfish. If these objects vanished, then the surviving site could look poorer, simpler, and less organized than the living community really was. This is one reason we must be careful when judging a possible drowned coastline way of life. Absence can be natural, not cultural. The sea takes this problem further. Waves and currents do not treat evidence gently. A light structure near a beach might be broken apart long before it was buried. Footprints in wet sand could be erased by the next tide. Hearth ash could scatter. Food waste could be sorted by weight. Small bones could be carried away. A sleeping hollow, a work area, or a path between camp and water might leave no lasting mark once storms and rising seas moved across it. Even if a place was used many times, its evidence could be spread thinly across a wide area or mixed with later deposits. The beginning of human history was lived through actions repeated daily, but repeated action does not always become durable evidence. A mother showing a child where to collect safely leaves no clear artifact. A group deciding to move camp before a storm leaves no layer of decision. A warning about a dangerous tide leaves no fossil. Yet these things are part of human life. They are part of how people survived long before writing. Underwater archaeology can sometimes recover delicate materials when they are sealed quickly in mud, peat, or low-oxygen sediment, but such preservation is rare and uneven. Most coastal lives would not be so fortunate. Their soft technologies would fade, and their remaining hard objects might seem like isolated clues. This is why a vanished coastline cannot be understood only by asking whether large ruins exist beneath the sea. Much of the real evidence may have been made from materials that were never meant to last. A people can be skilled without leaving monuments. A community can have order without stone walls. A coastline can hold generations of knowledge and still leave behind only shell, stone, bone, charcoal, and disturbed ground. If the sea has hidden part of the human beginning, it may have hidden not only places, but the most delicate evidence of how those places were actually lived. Real discoveries along ancient coasts have already changed the way researchers think about early human life, even when those discoveries do not prove a lost civilization. They show something more grounded and more important. Humans were able to use shorelines, marine food, and coastal routes earlier and more intelligently than older land-centered stories sometimes suggested. In several regions, archaeologists have found evidence that people gathered shellfish, used coastal caves, processed marine animals, or lived near old shore environments far back in prehistory. These findings do not all belong to the same time, place, or culture, and they should not be forced into one grand story. Their value is that they loosen the assumption that the coast was only a late or minor setting for human life. For Homo sapiens, whose beginnings were shaped by flexible adaptation in African landscapes of water, season, animals, plants, and changing climate, the ability to use a shoreline should not surprise us. A beach, estuary, or rocky coast offered problems, but it also offered patterns that careful people could learn. Tides returned, shellfish stayed in place, birds gathered, fish moved along rhythms, driftwood arrived, stone could be found in river gravels or coastal outcrops, fresh water could meet salt water in zones rich with life. Where evidence survives, it suggests that ancient people did not merely wander past the sea. In some places they knew how to make use of it. They may have returned to certain coastal locations, gathered food there, made tools there, cooked there, and carried knowledge of the shore through social learning. This matters because it gives the vanished coastline question a real foundation. We do not need to invent an advanced world under the waves to recognize that the coast could have been central to human survival. The stronger point is simpler. If ancient people used the coasts we can still study, then it is reasonable to ask what may have happened on the older coasts now underwater. Many of the best preserved examples come from places that stayed above sea level, such as coastal caves, raised shorelines, or protected deposits. But these surviving sites are likely only a portion of the older picture. The lower and more exposed coastal shelves where rivers, wetlands, and beaches once spread outward were often drowned when seas rose after the coldest ice age conditions. The beginning of the human story may therefore be easier to see in the places that escaped the water, while many equally important places disappeared from view. This creates a strange imbalance. A cave near an old shore may preserve shells and tools, so we call it evidence. A camp on a low plain beyond the modern coast may have been just as important, but if it was drowned, broken, or buried, it becomes absence. That absence can make early coastal life appear rarer than it was. Still, caution is necessary. A shell layer, a fish bone, or a coastal tool does not automatically prove permanent settlement, social complexity, or a broad shoreline civilization. Each site must be read in its own setting. Yet the pattern of real coastal evidence teaches a quiet lesson. Humans were not strangers to the sea. Before farming, before cities, and before writing, people could already build meaningful ways of living at the meeting place of land and water. If many of those meeting places now lie beneath the sea, then the visible record may preserve only the upper edge of a much wider human relationship with the coast. Some submerged places have already shown that old land surfaces can survive under the sea, and that people may have used them before water covered them. These discoveries are not always dramatic to the eye. They may be a buried forest, a peat layer, a stone tool found from the seabed, a drowned river channel, animal bones from a former plain, or traces of ancient soil sealed beneath marine sediment. Yet their quietness is exactly what makes them important. They prove that the seafloor is not only the bottom of the sea. In some regions, it is also the covered surface of an earlier human world. When researchers identify old channels, preserved tree stumps, worked stone or sediment that once formed marsh or dry ground, they are not finding a complete story. They are finding a doorway back into a landscape that the modern shoreline has hidden. For Homo sapiens, whose deeper beginning was shaped by moving through real environments rather than abstract spaces, such landscapes could have mattered deeply. A drowned channel could once have carried fresh water. A peat bed could once have been a wetland alive with plants, birds, insects, and animals. A low ridge could have been a dry path. A shelf now covered by water could have held places where people stopped, gathered, repaired tools, cooked food, or watched the movement of animals. The evidence may be sparse, but it changes the question. Instead of asking whether underwater landscapes are possible, we know they are. The harder question is how much human life those landscapes held, and how much of that life can still be recognized. In several parts of the world, underwater and intertidal research has shown that prehistoric surfaces can be preserved under mud, sand, or peat. Sometimes footprints, wooden remains, or worked materials survive when conditions are unusually protective. Sometimes fishing, dredging, or coastal erosion brings up objects that were once part of older land. These finds must be treated carefully because objects can move, and the sea can disturb context. A tool lifted from the water is meaningful, but it becomes far more meaningful when researchers can connect it to a dated surface, an ancient river system, or other environmental evidence. This is why submerged archaeology is slow. It is not enough to find something interesting. The object must be placed back into a lost landscape. The beginning of human history was never only a list of artifacts. It was the relation between artifacts, bodies, seasons, food, water, and memory. A stoneflake by itself is a mark. A stoneflake beside an old freshwater channel, near animal remains, under a buried land surface, begins to speak more clearly. Even then, it may whisper rather than explain. That whisper is still valuable. It tells us that the old coast was not empty by default. It tells us that the drowned margins of continents can preserve traces of people, animals, plants, and environments that shaped human choices. But it also warns us not to rush. A few submerged traces cannot be stretched into a full claim of an entire civilization. They can only show that the missing zone is real, that parts of it can survive, and that it deserves to be studied with patience. If the last Ice Age coastline held many small human worlds, some may now lie beneath mud and water, waiting not as a lost kingdom, but as broken evidence of ordinary lives once lived on land that the sea later made difficult to remember. The real evidence from ancient coasts changes the question, but it does not settle it. It tells us that humans could use shorelines early, that old land surfaces can survive underwater, and that the map of prehistory is missing many low coastal places. Yet it does not allow us to claim, with confidence, that a single large coastline civilization disappeared beneath the sea before the Ice Age ended. That difference is important. A careful story can be more powerful than a dramatic one, because it keeps faith with what can be known. We can say that lower sea levels exposed broad lands. We can say that people in many regions used water, rivers, coasts, shellfish, fish, birds, plants, stone, fire, and seasonal movement. We can say that rising seas later covered many of the places where such life may have unfolded. But to speak of cities, governments, writing, temples, ports, or a unified lost society would go beyond the evidence unless those things are found and studied in context. For Homo sapiens, whose beginning was shaped by adaptation, social learning, and bodily need, complexity did not always look like the later civilizations of river valleys and cities. It could look like a network of remembered shorelines, shared food knowledge, repeated camps, careful tool habits, and relationships between groups. Such a world could be highly meaningful and still leave no monument. This is why the phrase vanished civilization must be handled gently. If it means a lost empire, the evidence is not there. If it means organized coastal ways of life that may now be hidden, damaged, or missing from the dryland record, then the idea deserves attention. The danger lies in confusing possibility with proof. A submerged tool does not prove a settlement. A drowned forest does not prove a community. A shell deposit does not prove permanent life. A story about water does not prove a specific Ice Age event. Each clue has to be placed inside geology, dating, environment, and comparison with other sites. This is slow work, but it protects the truth. The beginning of human history is already remarkable without invention. People survived unstable climates, learned new foods, crossed difficult landscapes, reached islands, followed rivers, used fire, raised children, cared for one another, and carried knowledge through generations. That is enough to make the missing coast meaningful. We do not need to turn it into a fantasy to feel its weight. The more honest question is not whether there was a hidden Atlantis beneath every drowned shelf. It is whether our record of early human life is biased toward places that happen to remain dry. If the answer is yes, even partly, then the visible record is not false, but incomplete. It may show us caves more clearly than camps, stone more clearly than wood, high ground more clearly than estuaries, and preserved moments more clearly than moving lives. The sea may have hidden the ordinary places where human knowledge gathered slowly. It may have covered paths between groups, seasonal food grounds, old freshwater mouths, and the soft technologies that rarely survive. It may also have separated evidence that once belonged together, leaving one clue offshore, another inland, and a third destroyed before anyone could recognize the pattern. So the careful position for now is open, not closed. There is evidence that ancient people used coasts. There is evidence that old coastal landscapes drowned. There is evidence that some submerged surfaces can preserve traces. But there is not yet enough evidence to claim a full lost civilization in the strongest sense. What remains is a deeper, quieter possibility. Before the Ice Age ended, whole chains of coastal human life may have slipped beneath the sea, leaving us to reconstruct the beginning of our story from the higher ground that survived. What remains from the past is not always what mattered most. It is often what survived most easily. This simple difference can change the way we imagine early human history. A cave on dry land can protect tools, bones, ash, and painted walls. A high terrace can hold stone flakes for thousands of years. A dry shelter can preserve traces because water, waves, and salt never reached it. But a camp near an old shoreline may have been just as important in life and far less visible after death. If the sea later covered it, the evidence could be buried, scattered, dissolved, or moved away from its original place. This means the record we hold is not a complete mirror of the past. It is a selection made by geology, climate, chance, and survival. For Homo sapiens, whose beginning was shaped by changing African landscapes and later by movement through many environments, the places easiest to live in were not always the places easiest to find later. A river mouth could feed people, but also flood. A wetland could gather birds, fish, plants, and animals, but also bury and rot soft materials. A beach could provide shellfish, driftwood, stone, and travel routes, but also be erased by storms. A low coastal plain could support repeated life for generations, but when sea level rose, it stood directly in the path of disappearance. This creates a quiet bias. We may know more about inland shelters, not because inland shelters were always more central, but because they had better chances of surviving. We may know more about stone tools than wooden tools because stone lasts. We may know more about bones in caves than meals eaten near a tide pool because caves protect what shorelines disturb. When archaeologists build the story of early humanity, they are doing careful work with the evidence available. The problem is that the available evidence may be uneven from the start. A site on land can be excavated, dated, compared, and revisited. A drowned site may require expensive surveys, good visibility, calm water, rare preservation, and luck. Many may never be found. Others may be found only as fragments, without the full landscape around them. If people once lived along now submerged coasts, their world may be underrepresented in the story, not because it was unimportant, but because the sea placed it beyond ordinary reach. The beginning of human history was lived by bodies needing water, food, warmth, shelter, and social memory. Those needs often draw life toward edges where resources meet. Yet the very edge that gathered resources was also the edge most vulnerable to later drowning. This is why a vanished coastline civilization, understood carefully, challenges the shape of the archive. It asks whether we have mistaken preservation for importance. A dry cave with a few clear traces can feel more real to us than a drowned shoreline that may have held many lives but now gives only scattered clues. The cave is not false. The shoreline is not proven. But the difference in visibility can guide our imagination too strongly. Human history may look more inland than it really was because the land kept more of its witnesses. The sea did not need to destroy every trace to change the story. It only needed to hide enough of the low margins that later generations would begin their search from the places still dry, still reachable, and still able to speak. Dry places often make the past seem clearer than it was. A desert surface, a cave floor, a high plateau, or a sheltered rock overhang can hold traces for a very long time because they sit away from the constant disturbance of waves and tides. In such places, a stone tool may remain close to where it was dropped. Ash may stay in a hearth. Bones may be protected from water. Paint or marks on stone may endure because the surface itself has stayed stable. These places become powerful in archaeology because they can be visited, measured, excavated, and compared with care. Yet their strength can quietly shape our imagination. If the best evidence comes from caves, we may begin to picture early humans as cave people. If the best evidence comes from dry inland ground, we may begin to picture early history as mainly inland. But preservation is not the same as preference. Homo sapiens did not begin as a species designed for caves or deserts. Our deeper origins lay in varied African landscapes where survival depended on water, food, season, movement, shelter, and social memory. People used the places that helped them live, and many of those places were not ideal for long-term preservation. A shore can feed a person and erase that person's traces. A marsh can support birds, fish, plants, and animals, but decay the wood, fibre, and skin that made daily life possible. A river mouth can gather food and people, but also flood, shift, bury, and dissolve. A coastline can become a corridor of movement and memory, yet leave fewer clear remains than a colder, drier, less comfortable shelter above the water. This is why the land-based record may overrepresent certain environments. Caves preserve because they are protected. Deserts preserve because they are dry. Highlands preserve because the sea did not reach them. But old estuaries, beaches, lagoons, and coastal plains may have been among the most useful human settings and among the least likely to survive in a readable form. The result is a kind of archaeological imbalance. We may see the hard places better than the soft places. We may see the places of shelter better than the places of gathering. We may see stone more clearly than wood, bone more clearly than fibre, and dry camps more clearly than wet camps. This imbalance does not make archaeology unreliable. It makes careful archaeology even more important. Researchers know that every site is shaped by preservation, and every absence has to be examined before it becomes a conclusion. But for the larger story of vanished coastlines, the imbalance is especially important. If a low coastal community used light shelters, wooden tools, baskets, nets, fish traps, and paths across wet ground, most of its daily world could disappear without leaving dramatic ruins. If the same people also visited a cave during certain seasons, the cave might become their strongest surviving witness. The beginning of human history may therefore appear more rugged, more inland, and more stone-centered than the lived reality was. Human beings needed soft things as much as hard things. Carrying materials, wrapping materials, sleeping surfaces, shade, containers, cords, and knowledge held in voices. Safer archives do not always preserve richer lives. They preserve what conditions allowed. So when we look at caves, deserts, and high ground, we are not seeing the whole past. We are seeing the past that was given a better chance to remain. Beneath the sea may lie the weaker archive, harder to reach, easier to damage, but perhaps closer to many ordinary human days. The map of early human history is not only a map of where people lived, it is also a map of where evidence happened to survive, where researchers happened to look, and where the earth allowed traces to remain readable. This makes the record both precious and incomplete. A stone tool in a dry valley may be found because the ground stayed open. A hearth in a cave may be studied because the roof protected it. A bone on a high terrace may survive because the sea never reached it. But a camp on a low ice age shoreline may have vanished beneath water, or it may still exist beneath sand, mud, and marine sediment where few people can search easily. The difference between these places can create a quiet illusion. The visible past can begin to look like the whole past. For Homo sapiens, whose beginning was shaped by moving through changing environments, this would be a mistake. Humans did not live only where preservation was kind. They lived where water, food, shelter, materials, and social contact made survival possible. Many such places may have been low, wet, shifting, and close to the sea. Those landscapes were useful to life but vulnerable to time. If they disappeared, the pattern left behind may tell us as much about survival of evidence as about survival of people. This is why the present archaeological map should be read with humility. It may show concentrations of finds in caves, rock shelters, dry basins, raised beaches, and inland surfaces not because these were always the main centres of human life, but because they became the remaining windows. Other windows may have been covered. A coastline that supported repeated camps may now be invisible. A drowned river mouth may have held generations of seasonal knowledge. A plain now beneath shallow water may once have connected groups who appear separate on modern maps. A channel now crossed by boats may once have been a walking route. When these places vanish from sight, the surviving pattern can make human movement look more broken, more inland, or more sudden than it actually was. The beginning of our species' wider journey was probably made of many small links. Water sources, resting places, known food grounds, remembered crossings, and social ties between neighbouring groups. If some links are underwater, the chain looks shorter than it was. Chance also plays a role. A fishing net may pull up a tool from the seabed. A storm may expose an old surface for a brief time. A construction project may reveal a buried landscape. A researcher may choose one coast and not another, because funding, access, politics, technology, or weather allow it. This means discovery is not evenly distributed. Some missing places are missing because no one lived there. Others are missing because no one has yet found the right way to see them. Careful science must keep both possibilities open. It should not fill every blank with a lost civilization, but it should not treat every blank as emptiness. The coastlines before the Ice Age ended were part of the human stage. Some may have held only passing use. Some may have held repeated seasonal life. Some may have connected wider networks of movement and exchange. The sea has made those possibilities hard to separate, so the map we have is not a final portrait. It is a surviving fragment, shaped by stone, dryness, caves, high ground, research history, and luck. Beneath the water may lie not a single answer, but missing context, and without that context, the story of human beginnings may be flatter, drier, and less coastal than the lives that actually unfolded. If a coastline world disappeared, it may not have ended like a story with a single closing scene. The more likely image is slower and harder to hold, a long sequence of changes that reduce the usefulness of familiar places until people no longer lived in the same pattern. A low camp flooded more often, a sheltered inlet became exposed, a freshwater pool turned brackish, a river mouth shifted, a path between two groups became a wet crossing, then a dangerous channel, then open water. None of these changes alone would prove the death of a people. Each might invite adjustment, but when many adjunct presents gather across generations, a whole way of life can come apart without leaving the kind of ruin later history expects. For Homo sapiens, whose deeper beginning was shaped by surviving unstable climates, moving through varied landscapes, and passing knowledge from elders to children, such change would have been familiar in one sense and severe in another. Humans were flexible, but flexibility has limits when the landscape that holds memory keeps moving. A group can relocate a shelter, but it cannot carry the exact river mouth that fed it. It can teach a child a new path, but it cannot make the old meeting place remain above water. It can follow animals inland, but it may lose shellfish beds, bird grounds, fishing spots, stone sources, and neighbours along the shore. The loss would be ecological, social, and emotional all at once, even if no one named it that way. We should avoid imagining a sudden drowned city unless evidence supports it. The end of an Ice Age coastline community may have looked much more ordinary from within. People gathered what they could. They shifted camp. They watched storms. They returned to places less often. They met relatives farther inland. They learned new plants and new crossings. They continued living. The tragedy, if that word is used gently, is that survival itself can hide loss. Because people adapted, there may have been no single final disaster. Because they moved, their descendants may have carried on. Because the sea covered the low ground, the old pattern may have disappeared without leaving a clear boundary in the archaeological record. This is why the question of a vanished coastline civilization must be separated from the idea of instant collapse. A coastline way of life could vanish as a network. One strand was food, one strand was water, one strand was shelter, one strand was tool material, one strand was a route to another group, one strand was memory of where to return. Rising sea level, changing salinity, shifting wetlands, and moving shorelines could weaken each strand at a different speed. At first, the net still held. Later, it held only in certain seasons. Later still, it may have become easier to live elsewhere. The beginning of human history was made from these living networks, not from isolated dots on a map. A place mattered because it connected needs. When the connections broke, the people might not disappear, but the coastal world that had shaped them could fade beyond recognition. Archaeology may then find inland traces and call them a new pattern, while the older shoreline pattern lies underwater. It may find scattered tools and miss the route that once linked them. It may find a later camp and not see the drowned camp that came before. So if a coastal world vanished before the Ice Age fully ended, it may have vanished not through one night of destruction, but through the slow removal of relationships between land, water, food, memory, and human bodies trying to remain alive on a changing earth. A coastal world is not held together by land alone. It is held together by the relationships that land makes possible. One place gives fresh water. Another gives shellfish at low tide. Another gives stone that breaks cleanly. Another gives wood after storms. Another gives shelter from wind. Another marks a route to neighbouring people. Another is remembered because children were born there, elders died there, or a group returned there when the season changed. When the sea rises, it may not destroy all of these at once. It may separate them. That separation can be more damaging than the loss of a single camp. A community can move its sleeping place and still return to the shore. It can find another water source and still keep an old fishing ground. But when water, food, shelter, tool material, and social roots begin to drift apart, the whole pattern of life becomes harder to maintain. For Homo sapiens, whose beginning was shaped by the need to connect body, memory, and landscape, this kind of separation would have mattered deeply. Humans do not live from resources in isolation. They live from access. A shellfish bed is useful only if people can reach it safely. A spring is useful only if it remains drinkable. A stone source is useful only if it lies within a workable route. A meeting place is useful only if other people can still come. Rising seas could turn these once-linked places into fragments. A low path might become a channel. A familiar marsh might become open water. A ridge might become an island. A river valley might become an inlet. What once formed a continuous human map could become scattered points, each still visible for a while but no longer easily connected. This is how a coastline life could thin out before it disappeared. People might still visit certain places, but less often. They might still know the old route, but only in good weather. They might still meet other groups, but at a different place and with more uncertainty. Food gathering might take more time. Travel might cost more energy. Children might learn fewer of the old landmarks because some were already gone. Over generations, the human world would not simply move inland like a line drawn on paper. It would be rebuilt from pieces. Some coastal skills might remain useful, others might fade. A family that once relied on fish and shellfish might depend more on river foods, plants, or land animals. A group that once followed the shore might follow a valley. A meeting network that once stretched along beaches might bend around new water barriers. The beginning of human history was shaped by these networks of access long before cities made roads or states made borders. People belonged to places through repeated use, and repeated use depended on connection. When the connections broke, belonging had to be remade. Archaeology may see only the later result. Tools on higher ground, camps farther inland, scattered shell, drowned surfaces offshore. It may not easily see the broken network that joined them before the sea advanced. That is why the loss of a coastline civilization, in the careful sense, should not be imagined only as land going underwater. It may have been a loss of arrangement. The people could continue, but the arrangement that made their old life stable could fail. Food was still somewhere, water was still somewhere, stone was still somewhere, other people were still somewhere. But the distances changed, the routes changed, and the old rhythm no longer held. A world can vanish when its pieces remain. If the pattern connecting those pieces has been taken away by water, what remains after a coastal world breaks apart may look very small compared with the life that once made it meaningful. A stone tool may rest far from the hand that shaped it. A shell layer may survive without the shelter, basket, firewood, and voices that surrounded it. A drowned river channel may still lie beneath the seabed, but the crossings, paths, and seasonal returns attached to it are gone from sight. If people moved inland as the sea rose, they may have carried habits and memories with them, while the low places that explained those habits disappeared. Later, an archaeologist might find a tool on higher ground and another clue offshore, but the living connection between them would be difficult to rebuild. This is why the final traces of a vanished coastline life may appear scattered, quiet, and incomplete. For Homo sapiens, whose beginning was shaped by learning landscapes through the body, a place was never only coordinates. It was thirst answered, food found, danger avoided, children taught, and old knowledge tested against each new season. When such a place went underwater, what vanished was not only soil, the arrangement of memory vanished with it. A tool can survive without the reason it was carried. A shell can survive without the meal. A burned stone can survive without the night around the fire. A story can survive without the original bay, marsh, or valley it once described. These separated remains can make the past seem thinner than it was. They can also invite exaggeration, because silence is easy to fill with imagined certainty. The careful path lies between those errors. We should not pretend that scattered tools prove a hidden empire. We should also not assume that scattered tools came from simple or unimportant lives. A coastal community could have left only modest remains because most of its world was made of movement, soft materials, seasonal return, and shared knowledge. If the sea then covered the place, even the modest remains might be broken or displaced. What later survives may be only a few hard fragments and an absence shaped like water. This absence is not empty in the ordinary sense. It is an absence created by known processes: warming climate, melting ice, rising seas, shifting sediment, erosion, decay, and the difficulty of searching underwater. Around many old coastlines, the most meaningful evidence may not appear as one grand sight. It may appear as a pattern too damaged to read easily: an old land surface, a stone scatter, animal remains, shell, charcoal, peat, pollen, and a drowned channel that once carried fresh water toward a shore, now gone. The beginning of human history was lived in such link settings, and when the links are lost, the evidence can look accidental. A memory of water may remain in story. A food habit may continue inland. A route may bend around a new inlet. A group may merge with others and become something new. The people survive, but the old coast no longer gives the future a clear witness. This is perhaps the most sober way to imagine what the sea took. It did not need to bury towers or erase a single capital. It could hide a chain of ordinary human worlds, each built from practical knowledge and repeated return. It could leave behind objects without context, stories without maps, and gaps where the richest lowlands once lay. Before the Ice Age fully ended, if such coastal worlds existed in many places, their disappearance may now be felt less as a spectacular ruin than as a missing frame around the earliest human picture. What we see may be only the dry edge of a wider story, and what we cannot see may be the old shore where human skill, loss, and adaptation once met quietly before the water settled over them. The question at the end of this journey should not be whether Atlantis was real. That question pulls the mind toward a single hidden city, a single lost people, and a single dramatic answer. The quieter question is more useful. How much of the human setting has the sea removed from view? Before the Ice Age ended, many coastlines were not where they are now. Broad shelves were exposed. Rivers ran across land that is now seabed. Wetlands, estuaries, low plains, and sheltered shores may have offered food, fresh water, stone, wood, roots, and repeated places of return. If people lived there, they did not need to be builders of monuments for their lives to matter. They needed to know the ground. They needed to read water, weather, animals, plants, tides, and seasons. They needed to teach children where safety began and where danger waited. That kind of knowledge can shape a human world deeply, even if it leaves only faint marks. For Homo sapiens, whose beginnings lay in long adaptation to changing African environments and later expansion through many climates, the oldest human achievement was not architecture. It was the ability to keep memory alive inside a moving landscape. A coastline could be one of the strongest places for that memory, because it gathered many needs together. But it was also one of the most vulnerable places when ice melted and seas rose. This creates the central difficulty. The places that may have helped people most may be the places hardest for us to study. A cave above the water can remain. A dry plateau can remain. A stone scatter on high ground can remain. But a camp near an ancient river mouth may now be under mud, sand, salt water, and shifting currents. If we look only where evidence is easy to reach, we may mistake the surviving edge for the whole beginning. This does not mean we should invent a grand coastal civilization without proof. That would make the story less honest, not more profound. But it does mean we should widen the frame. Early human complexity may have existed in forms that were practical, seasonal, mobile, and perishable. A community could be organized through routes instead of streets, through remembered gathering places instead of fixed markets, through shared skill instead of written law, through returning seasons instead of permanent walls. Such a life could be rich in meaning and poor in durable remains. When the sea rose, it could cover not only camps but also the relationships between camps, the path from fresh water to shellfish, the route from a shelter to a stone source, the meeting place between groups, the safe crossing known to elders. What disappeared then may have been context. Without context, objects become lonely. A stone tool found inland may not reveal the drowned shore that once supported its maker's family. A shell offshore may not reveal the hands that gathered it. A story of water may not reveal the landscape that gave it form. The beginning of human history may therefore be less like a straight line and more like a shoreline after the tide has changed, with some marks visible, some blurred, and some already gone. The sea does not force us to believe in a lost empire. It asks us to accept a more careful uncertainty, that the earliest human world may have been broader, wetter, more coastal, and more fragile than the dry record can easily show. And in that uncertainty there is value. It reminds us that history is not only made from what survives, but also from learning how survival itself can hide what came before. The sea can be imagined as an ending, but it can also be imagined as an archive. It is not an archive like a library, ordered, dry, and easy to open. It is an archive that breaks, buries, moves, and hides what it keeps. Beneath some shallow waters may lie old soils, river channels, peat beds, animal bones, stone tools, and the remains of landscapes where people once walked. Beneath other waters there may be nothing left in place, because waves, currents, erosion, and time have already taken it apart. This unevenness is what makes the question both powerful and difficult. The sea may contain some of the earliest coastal chapters of Homo sapiens, but it does not preserve them for us in a simple form. It asks for patience. It asks researchers to rebuild lost ground from fragments, to separate human marks from natural movement, and to remember that a quiet trace can matter without becoming a dramatic claim. For early humans, the coast was not a mystery to be solved. It was a place to live with. A river meeting the sea could mean fresh water, fish, birds, Plants, mud, tracks, shelter, and direction. A bay could become a seasonal return. A ridge above a wetland could become a safe sleeping place. A stretch of beach could become a path between known points. These places may have held the first lessons that later archaeology struggles to recover. Where food appeared, when storms came, which water could be trusted, where children could walk, how far a group could travel before night. The beginning of humanity was carried through such practical memory. It was not only in skulls, tools, or bones, but in the relationship between bodies and repeated places. If many of those places now lie underwater, then the sea holds not just lost land, but lost context. It may hold the missing relationship between a tool and the food it helped prepare, between a shell bed and the people who returned to it, between an old river and the route it once made possible. This does not mean the sea is hiding a single answer. It may be hiding many small beginnings, many local solutions, many coastal experiments in survival. Some may have been brief. Some may have lasted many generations. Some may have linked people over long distances through shore routes and river mouths. Some may have faded without leaving more than stone, shell, bone, and altered soil. The honest value of the underwater archive is not that it proves everything we wonder about. Its value is that it keeps the question open in a grounded way. It reminds us that the dry land record is not the whole human record. It reminds us that early people may have known landscapes we can no longer stand on. It reminds us that adaptation often happens in places too soft, too wet, or too low to preserve themselves clearly. The sea is silent but not empty. It has covered parts of the stage on which human memory first learned to move along water, and if future discoveries slowly recover even small pieces of that stage, they may not reveal a lost empire. They may reveal something more human, how ordinary groups with careful hands and shared memory learned to live at the edge of a changing world before that edge moved beyond reach. If the first chapters of human history were written beside water, then some of those chapters may now be unreadable from land. This does not make the past magical, it makes it fragile. Before the Ice Age ended, the world's coastline stood in different places, and many low shelves around the continents were open ground, crossed by rivers, wetlands, animal paths, and perhaps human routes. Some of those places may have held nothing more than short visits. Some may have held seasonal camps. Some may have held repeated networks of families, tools, food knowledge, and memory. We cannot name them with certainty. We cannot draw their borders. We cannot call them cities without evidence. But we can understand why their absence matters. Homo sapiens began as a species of bodies moving through real landscapes, not as a species of written records. Our oldest continuity came from finding water, sharing food, carrying children, tending fire, making tools, and teaching memory from one generation to another. A coastline could gather many of those needs in one place, and a rising sea could remove that place from the future. The lesson is not that every drowned coast hides a lost civilization. The lesson is that the human story may be shaped as much by what disappeared as by what remained. Dry caves, high ground, deserts, and protected shelters gave us strong evidence, and that evidence is precious. Yet the lower edges of the ancient world may have held equally important lives that became harder to see because the sea covered their ground, moved their objects, and dissolved their softer traces. In that sense, the beginning of history may not be a single point on dry land. It may be a broken shoreline, with some signs preserved above water and others resting below it. This should make us more careful, not more certain. It should make us slower to dismiss old coastal landscapes as empty, and slower to fill them with imagined kingdoms. Between denial and fantasy there is a quieter space where science can ask patient questions. What was once dry where water now lies? Which old rivers crossed the shelves? Where did people find fresh water, stone, fuel, food and shelter? Which traces survived by chance, and which vanished because they were made of wood, fibre, skin, footprints, smoke and spoken memory? These questions have value because they return dignity to ordinary human life. A vanished coastline, if it held people, did not need towers to matter. It mattered because people may have learned there, rested there, mourned there, raised children there, watched the tide there, and carried knowledge from that place into another place when the water came. If future discoveries recover more of these drowned landscapes, They may not give us one grand answer. They may give us many small corrections. They may show that early humanity was more coastal, more mobile, more adaptive, and more dependent on fragile environments than the surviving map suggests. And that would be enough. It would remind the listener that history is not only a record of power, monuments, and conquest. It is also a record of shelter found before night, food gathered at the edge of water, and memory carried when the ground could no longer be trusted. Before the Ice Age ended, an entire coastline way of life may have vanished beneath the sea, not as a final certainty, but as a careful possibility held open by geology, archaeology, and the missing shape of the old world. So if the first shore of memory now lies underwater, where should the first page of human history truly begin?